The fluorescent tube above the repair bench had been dying for 3 weeks. A slow, irregular strobe that Avery had trained herself to ignore, the same way she'd trained herself to ignore the draft coming through the cracked rear window and the hollow sound the furnace made before it stopped bothering entirely. She was bent over the movement of a 1920s bracket clock, her loop pressed to her eye, when she heard the cars pull up outside, 2 of them, maybe 3. The engines had a particular quality, low and deliberate, the sound of something large and expensive that had nowhere it needed to be in a hurry. Not a delivery, not the parking inspector who came down Aldgate Street every Tuesday. These were cars that moved like they owned the pavement beneath them. Avery set down her pegwood pick. She didn't move from her stool. She had known this moment was coming for 4 months, ever since the bank had called to tell her that the loan secured against the shop's lease, a loan she had never signed, never seen, never agreed to, had been sold to a private holding company called Gallard Capital, LLC. The kind of company that existed only as a name on a document and a wire transfer to an account in Delaware. Her father had borrowed $280,000 from people who didn't do payment plans. He had done it quietly, over the course of 2 years, while Avery had been in the shop 16 hours a day, trying to keep the business he'd nearly run into the ground the first time from hitting the ground again. He had done it because he loved blackjack the way most men loved oxygen, and because he had always genuinely believed that this hand, this table, this night would be different. He had died in March owing $280,000, and with interest it was north of $340,000 now, and he had left Avery holding the bill, the shop, and a draft letter of apology he'd never finished. The door opened. Avery put down her loop. She turned around on the stool and crossed her arms and waited. 3 men came in first. They moved like men who were paid to look at rooms before other people entered them, scanning the shelves of bracket clocks and mantel clocks and carriage clocks, the rows of grandfather clock movements hanging on the pegboard wall, the workbench littered with mainsprings and escapement wheels and tiny brass click springs no bigger than a fingernail. One of them, a wide-shouldered man with a jaw like a piece of masonry, let his eyes linger on Avery for a half-second too long before he stepped aside. The man who came in last was wearing a charcoal suit that had no business being within a mile of a clock shop. He was tall, not in a way that drew attention, but in the way that made the space around him feel compressed, like the room had quietly adjusted to accommodate him. His face was angular, sharp-boned, and completely without expression. A scar ran along his jaw, a thin old white line that suggested the wound had been deep and the stitching had been perfunctory. He looked around the shop slowly, not out of curiosity, more like he was pricing it. "Caine Clockworks," he said. His voice was low and deliberate. "Your grandfather started this place in 1961. "My great-grandfather." Avery kept her voice flat. "Did you come to discuss real estate history, or is there something I can actually help you with?" His eyes moved to her. He had dark grey eyes the color of old steel, and they settled on her face with the same unhurried assessment he'd given the room. "You already know why I'm here. I know your holding company bought my father's debt. I know you've been sitting on it for 4 months without contacting me. I know that means you've been watching the shop to see how close I am to shutting the doors on my own." She uncrossed her arms and picked her pegwood pick back up, rolling it between her fingers. "I also know that you're Stellan Mast, and I know you don't show up personally for a $340,000 debt unless you want something other than money." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. He pulled out the chair across from her workbench without being invited and sat down. His men fanned out behind him, positioned at angles that would have been casual to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. "Your father was a man of poor judgment," Mast said. "You are not. Save the compliment. What do you want?" He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. He laid it on the work table between the clock movement and her case of mainspring tools. "The debt ledger. The deed transfer your father signed on the lease. My company's mortgage instrument on this property. He paused. Everything. Avery stared at the envelope. She did not touch it. What do you want? She said again. The same words, the same flat voice. Mast looked at her for a moment, that long, pricing look, and then he reached into his other pocket and set a small black box on the table next to the envelope. He didn't open it. A wife. The silence in the shop was total. Even the clocks on the wall seemed to hold their pendulums. Behind Mast, the wide-shouldered man, Taft, went very still in a way that suggested he had not known this part was coming. On Mast's left, a younger man in a grey overcoat was staring at the side of his boss's face like he was waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. I operate in a world where stability is currency, Mast said. His tone hadn't changed. He could have been explaining a wire transfer. The families I deal with, the ones who control the infrastructure I depend on, they don't trust a man with no anchor. A bachelor with no stake in permanence is a man who has nothing to lose. That makes him unpredictable. It makes him a risk. So buy a socialite. Avery's voice was remarkably steady. You have the money. Why drive a $180,000 car to a clock shop in Pilsen? Because I don't need a socialite. He said it simply, with no heat. I've watched this shop for 4 months. I've watched you manage inventory for a business that's $340,000 underwater without letting a single supplier know how bad it is. I've watched you handle a contractor who tried to overbill you by 11%. You caught it on page 4 of the invoice, and you didn't raise your voice. I watched you throw out 2 men who came in here last month trying to lift your display case with nothing but a pry bar and a locked door. He gestured at the shop. I don't need a woman who will spend my money and talk to her friends about my business. I need someone who knows how to read a ledger, hold a line, and not break under pressure. He pushed the black box toward her. You marry me. I clear the debt. This building becomes yours, free of any instrument. You attend necessary functions. You do not discuss anything you hear in my home. In return, you never have to look at that envelope again. Avery looked at the black box. She could hear the particular slow tick of the Vienna regulator on the wall behind her, the one she'd restored 3 years ago from a movement her great-grandfather had saved from a fire. She had been working on that clock the week her father's first gambling debt came due. She picked up the black box. Mast's shoulders settled almost imperceptibly, a small release of tension, a man who was used to winning. She opened it. The diamond inside was enormous and ugly, and completely without personality. She closed the box. She pushed it back across the table until it stopped at the edge and teetered there. No. The word hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. Taft's hand moved to his jacket. Taft, Mast said it quietly. Without looking at him, Taft's hand stopped. Mast looked at Avery. There was nothing in his face. You don't understand the position you're in, he said. I understand it perfectly. She stood up from the stool. Her hands weren't shaking. She noted that with mild surprise. You bought a dead man's debt and you came here expecting me to be frightened enough to say yes to anything. You brought 3 men to make sure I understood the alternative. You put an envelope full of legal documents on my work table so I'd know exactly how far underwater I am. She stepped around the table, and you brought a ring so I'd feel like you were offering me something instead of taking something. Avery. You want a transaction. Her voice was level. You want a woman you can itemize in your ledger under assets. Stabilizing, and I understand why a man like you thinks that way. Everything in your world has a number on it. Every person, every arrangement, every obligation. You don't know another way to operate. She picked up her pegwood pick from the bench. But I am not an asset class. I am not a hedge against federal scrutiny, and I am not going to pretend to be your wife so you can sit across from men twice as dangerous as you are, and look like you have something worth protecting. She set the pegwood pick down. Get out of my shop. Taft took a full step forward. The younger man's hand was inside his jacket. The third enforcer had shifted to her left, cutting off the path to the rear exit. Mast looked at her for a long moment. His face was still. Then he looked down at the black box on the edge of her workbench. He picked it up. He put it back in his pocket. He picked up the envelope and returned it to his inner breast pocket. Then, very slowly, he took off his jacket. Behind him, Taft's face moved through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, alarm, and finally something that looked almost like awe. Mast laid the jacket over the back of the chair. He reached up and pulled his tie loose, lifted it over his head, draped it over the jacket. He rolled his shirt cuffs up to the elbow. His forearms were corded with muscle and marked with 2 scars, one long and faded on his left arm, one short and recent-looking near his right wrist. He walked past her, deeper into the shop. He stopped in front of the grandfather clock movement, propped against the back wall, a massive 1880s 8-day long case movement, all brass and steel, weighing somewhere north of 80 pounds. Avery had been trying for 2 weeks to figure out how to get it from the floor to the delivery pallet by herself. It was too heavy to lift alone, and too awkward to drag without damaging the delicate rack and snail striking mechanism. Mast looked at it. He looked back at Avery. Where does it need to go? She stared at him. The pallet's right there, Taft offered quietly. From somewhere behind her, he sounded completely baffled. Mast looked at her and waited. That movement is worth $14,000, Avery said. If you drop it. Then tell me how not to drop it. She stood there for another 3 seconds. Then she walked to the shelf behind him and pulled down 2 furniture pads. She showed him how to wrap the movement, which side to protect, where the vulnerable components were, how to grip the mounting board without putting pressure on the click spring assembly. He listened with the focused attention of a man who did not ask questions twice. Taft, Slater Cruz. He didn't raise his voice. Wait outside. Taft opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Avery once, a long, measuring look that communicated something very specific about what would happen if Mast came to any harm, and then the 3 of them filed out. The brass bell above the door chimed once, absurdly cheerful, and they were gone. Avery stood with Mast in the quiet shop. The clocks ticked. The fluorescent tube flickered twice and steadied. Right side, she said finally. Grip the mounting board here and here. Do not let the crutch swing. They moved the clock movement together. It took 22 minutes. Mast didn't complain. He didn't ask for a break. When the movement settled onto the pallet and Avery ratcheted the shipping straps down, his shirt was damp at the back and there was a long smear of brass polish across his right forearm. A small cut on his index finger was beading blood where a sharp edge of the mounting bracket had caught him. He looked at his hands. Why are you still here? Avery asked. He was looking at the pallet, not at her. I told you something true tonight. I told you I need someone who won't break under pressure. That's true. He paused. What I didn't say is that I've been in this shop 9 times over the past 4 months, 7 times buying things I had no use for, twice just standing in the back, looking at the movements on your pegboard. He finally turned. In 4 months of watching this place, I've seen you hold a failing business together with bad lighting and no heat, and a supplier base that has no idea how close to the edge you are. I've seen you catch a fraudulent invoice, neutralize 2 theft attempts, and handle a lease renewal that should have gone sideways 3 different ways. He looked at his bleeding hand. I didn't come here tonight with a transaction, Avery. I came here with a transaction because it's the only language I've known how to speak since I was 19 years old. And it was the wrong one. She went to the supply cabinet and came back with the first aid kit. Give me your hand. He held it out. She cleaned the cut without ceremony, taped it shut with 2 strips of closure tape. His hands were large and the knuckles were scarred in the particular way of a man who had used them for things other than paperwork. My father borrowed from your people because he thought he was going to win it back, Avery said. She kept her eyes on his hand. He always believed the next hand would be different. He borrowed from men like you because a bank would have checked his account history and said no, and your people just wrote the number down and handed him the shovel. She let go of his hand. You didn't create his addiction. But your ledger is built out of men who were already drowning." Mast was quiet for a moment. "I know." He said it without defense, just two flat words that acknowledged the full weight of what she'd said. "I grew up in a house where men like me showed up at the door regularly," he said. "My mother's debts, not my father's. He was gone by the time I was 9. I watched what happened to her when she missed payments. I went to the men who came to our door and I asked them for work. I was 16. He stood up from the chair. "I built this organization because I understood early that power isn't cruelty. Cruelty is just what power looks like when it's lazy. Control is cleaner. But I have still spent 23 years running a system that hands shovels to drowning men." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm telling you I know exactly what I am." Avery looked at him. The scar along his jaw caught the flickering light. "Then why are you still in my shop?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. "Because you said no to me in front of my men, and I've had people refuse me before. Out of stupidity, out of fear, out of miscalculation. You were none of those things. You looked at everything I was holding over your head and you said no because the thing I was asking you to give up was worth more to you than the thing I was offering." He paused. "I haven't had to think about what something is actually worth to the person who built it in a very long time." She walked to the back office and came out with 2 mugs and a carafe of coffee that had been sitting on the burner since 7 in the morning. She set 1 mug on the workbench in front of him. He picked it up. He didn't comment on the taste, which told her either his threshold for bad coffee was high or his manners were more careful than she'd expected. They sat in the shop for another hour. She asked him 4 direct questions about the debt, the interest calculation, the transfer instrument, the legal standing of the lease mortgage, and he answered all of them without qualification. His answers were precise. He spoke about financial structures the way she spoke about escapement mechanisms, with the fluency of someone who had been living inside the system long enough that its logic was instinct. He left at 9. He put on his jacket, straightened the collar, and paused at the door. "I'll be back tomorrow. There's a movement on your south shelf that has a broken third-wheel pivot. I'd like to understand how you fix it." He was gone before she could tell him not to come. He came back the next day in different clothes. No tie, no bespoke overcoat. Dark wool, serviceable boots. He came alone. He sat on the stool across from her bench and watched her work. When she pointed at things, he handed them to her. When she explained things, he asked 1 question, usually the right one. On the 3rd day, 2 men came into the shop 40 minutes after Mast arrived. They weren't his men. Avery could tell immediately. The way they held themselves was looser, more volatile, with the twitchy energy of people trying to project threat rather than people who didn't have to try. One of them she recognized from a photograph Mast had shown her the afternoon before, part of an explanation about a man named Kolb who ran freight operations on the northwest side. "Shop's closed," the man in front said. He had a hand inside his jacket. "We're looking for Mast." Avery kept her hands on the clock movement she was working on. "No one here by that name." "Lady." The second man stepped around the display case. "We saw his car." "Then go talk to his car." Behind her, she heard the precise, quiet sound of Mast getting up from the stool. She had known, in theory, that the man who sat across from her bench asking careful questions about mainspring tension was the same man who had built a criminal organization from nothing. She had not, until this moment, seen those 2 things occupy the same body at the same time. She was not going to describe what happened in the shop in any detail. Later, when she thought about it, it was fast and deliberate, and completely without the quality she'd seen in films. It lasted less than 40 seconds. Mast was cut. The second man had a knife, and it caught his left forearm when he deflected. By the time Avery turned around fully, both of Colby's men were on the floor, and Mast was standing in the center of the shop with blood soaking through his sleeve, breathing hard. He looked at her face and then immediately looked away, like he was giving her a moment. "I'll call Taft," he said. "Sit down," Avery said. She was already at the cabinet. She came back with the kit and a stool, and she made him sit and take his jacket off. She cut the sleeve of his shirt away. She did not apologize for ruining it, and she looked at the cut, long, ugly, deep enough to need closing. "I've sutured leather before," she said. "Hold still." He was quiet while she worked. The clocks ticked. "You're going to have to go handle whatever comes next," she said, tying off the fourth suture. "Kolb won't let this sit." "No." "And you can't do that from here." "No." She wrapped the arm in clean gauze and taped it. She sat back and looked at him. "You brought this to my door," she said. His jaw was tight. "I'm sorry." It was the first time he had said those words to her, and she believed them entirely, which she hadn't expected. "Go, she's handle it." He stood. He picked up his ruined jacket. He looked at her once, a long look, the kind that wanted to say something and chose not to, and then he walked out. She heard his phone connect before he hit the sidewalk. He was gone for 5 days. Taft came on the 4th morning. He knocked on the rear door. 3 knocks, measured and deliberate. And when Avery let him in, he was wearing the expression of a man who had not slept since Tuesday. "He's fine," Taft said immediately, "before you ask." "I wasn't going to ask." Taft looked at her. He had the eyes of a man who read rooms fast and was using that skill on her right now. "Right." He leaned against the door frame. "The situation with Colby is resolved." "Resolved meaning?" Taft was quiet for a moment. "He didn't kill anyone. That's not how this normally goes." He seemed faintly unsettled by saying it out loud. He bought Colby's receivables at a fraction of their value through 3 shell companies over 48 hours. Colby's operation is technically solvent but practically strangled. He'll be out of the city in a month. Avery looked at her workbench. "That sounds like it cost him more than the other way." "Significantly. In time and money and about 15 years of relationships he called in at once." Taft paused. "He told us no collateral. Those were the exact words. No collateral on this one." He held her gaze. "I've worked for Stellan Mast for 11 years. He doesn't change the rules. When he does, there's a reason." He pushed off the doorframe. "Don't waste the reason." He left. Avery stood alone in the shop. The clocks ticked. The fluorescent light above the bench, which had been flickering for 3 weeks, had finally steadied sometime in the last few days. She wasn't sure exactly when. She thought about the envelope he'd laid on her table. She thought about the debt and the ledger, and the way he'd said "I know" when she'd told him the truth about his operation. She thought about him sitting on that stool, quiet and patient, handing her the right tool before she could ask for it. She took off her work apron. She locked the front door. She turned the sign. She drove to the building in the financial district that she'd already looked up 3 weeks ago, with the same automatic professional curiosity with which she researched everything she thought she might need to understand. She went to the 39th floor. The receptionist looked at Avery's steel-toed boots with polite alarm. Avery walked past her. The conference room was full of men in suits who went silent when she pushed the door open. Mast was at the head of the table. He looked tired in the particular way of someone who had not stopped moving in 5 days. He looked up when she came in and went very still. "Gentlemen," he didn't raise his voice. "We're finished." The men filed out. She waited until the door clicked shut behind the last one. "Taft told me what you did with Colby," she said. It was the cleanest resolution available. It was expensive and time-consuming, and you didn't have to do it that way. She crossed the room and stopped in front of his chair. "You did it because you were thinking about what I said, about the ledger, about what it's built out of." He didn't deny it. He just watched her. "I'm not going to marry you," Avery said. "I know. But I want to make a different offer." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, the same way he had sat down at her workbench without being invited. "You need someone who can read a ledger, hold a line, and not break under pressure." Those were your words. They were. "You also need someone who will tell you when you're using the wrong language, someone who won't perform compliance and call it partnership." She put her hands flat on the mahogany table. I have a debt of $340,000 that legally belongs to your holding company. I have a shop I've kept alive by sheer force of will and not much else. And I apparently have whatever it was you came to look at 9 times in 4 months. She met his eyes. I am not an asset class. I am not your alibi. I am not a stability hedge. She kept her voice level and absolute. But I am someone who knows how to work next to you. I've seen what that looks like this week. It works. She paused. So here is my offer. You tear up the debt instrument. Not as a gift, not as a transaction, just as the thing that needs to happen before we can start from an honest place. And then we figure out what we're actually building, on terms that are genuinely equal. You don't hide things from me. I don't pretend not to know what I know. She held his gaze. You want someone who won't break. That goes both ways. I need a man who'll tell me the truth, even when the truth is that he's a controlled monster operating in a world I'm only beginning to understand. Mast was quiet. He looked down at his hands, one with the closure tape she'd applied 4 days ago, one wrapped in clean bandaging over her sutures. You drove here in your work clothes to make a business proposal, he said. I drove here because I'm tired of waiting to see what comes next. She did not look away. And because someone spent 5 days making decisions I indirectly caused, and I thought that deserved a direct conversation rather than another month of uncertainty. Something shifted in his face, slow and careful, like a mechanism that hadn't moved in a long time. He reached into his jacket pocket. He set the black box on the table between them. Still the wrong question, Avery said. I know. He didn't open it. He left it sitting there between them. I'm not asking anything yet. I'm telling you that the thing in that box is not what it was when I put it on your work table last week. It's not a transaction. He looked at her steadily. It's a question I don't know how to ask in the right language yet. You have time to learn. I know. A pause settled between them, comfortable in the way that silences between people who understand each other can be. Is the third wheel pivot on the movement in your south case still broken? He asked. I fixed it yesterday. Then I'll find something else that needs explaining. Avery looked at him for a moment. Then she stood up and picked up the black box and set it in his hand and closed his fingers around it. Start with being honest when you don't know something, she said. That's the hardest part, for men like you. The rest of it you can learn. She walked to the door. Avery. She stopped. The debt instrument is already gone, Mast said. I destroyed it 2 days ago. A pause that cost him something. The building is yours. I should have led with that. I'm sorry that I didn't. She stood with her hand on the door. She thought about the envelope landing on her work table with that dead, heavy sound. She thought about 4 months of watching through a window and a man willing to shred 23 years of operational habit over 48 sleepless hours, and a cut on his forearm that was going to leave a scar, regardless of how carefully she'd closed it. Yeah, she said quietly, you should have. She walked out through the marble lobby and past the receptionist and into the sharp Chicago cold. In 3 days, Mast would walk into the shop at 9 in the morning with 2 cups of decent coffee and a question about the difference between a deadbeat escapement and a recoil. He would stay until 6. He would leave grease on her best polishing cloth and ask her, at the door, if he could come back the next day. She would say yes. Not because she owed him anything. Not because the debt had been lifted from her chest like a physical weight, leaving her dizzy and raw and furious and something else she hadn't named yet. Because she had watched a man who priced everything in ledger columns sit down with his hands on a broken piece of machinery and decide, for once, that some things were worth more than their number. She didn't know yet what they were building, but she knew how to start from the bones up. She'd been doing it her whole life.